I suspect that Louise, in the question she's asking, was thinking of or had been wondering about the quote that I gave you from Degas, which was, "It's all silhouettes." Now he's talking about painting. Degas, I don't know if he ever talked about anything else. So it's all silhouettes. So Louise asks, "Can you speak specifically of the topic of the silhouette when composing and setting up a painting? Also, when in the painting process you might consider accentuating or emphasizing the points of silhouette. I'm sorry, the points of the silhouette with line, if at all." So, thank you, Louise. Let's look at that. The question of composing and setting up a painting is, you'll know, I'm not going to talk about that specifically yet. I hope I don't forget to talk about it before I get to the end. But I think in the course of showing you these pictures, I'll give you some idea of how I think about it, and then I'll try to review it. Let's see if I can remember to do that. Okay. All right. So the silhouette. This is the little discussion of the silhouette. Ang says basically that you mustn't neglect this idea of the silhouette, the patterns. He's talking to the Greek vases. He tells you to look at them. Well, that's pure silhouette, right? And so when we're talking about silhouette art, that some people have. I think in Disneyland you can sit down and have somebody sit there and they will take a pair of scissors and cut out the shape of your head, or you and somebody else sitting next to you, and you see those in little cameos like that in people's homes. This is pure silhouette. It just means a cutout shape. You could argue it means no lost and found, pure cutout of the shape of an object, right? So is that all it means? I mean, if you think of it that way, then you understand probably a little bit better both Ang and Leighton. And here are the pictures of their work. It seems clear in the Leighton that virtually every single person in this painting is treated as a silhouette, except that they don't always silhouette. And I'm not showing you a particular Ang that does this, but although this one might do it, I haven't looked that close at it, but where you can find that there's this careful articulation of all the drawing around every object, so much so that it's virtually as if they'd made a silhouette. And it seems to me like when you're using line as your base and you've drawn a complete outline, you'll be loath to not use it, right? Now, I only say that because I'm speaking as a Boston School type painter who paints from the visual impression. But silhouette just simply means a contrasty cutout. And usually we mean figure. But when you start talking Boston School, you mean something else. So let me just, Manet I mentioned for a second, because he was this sort of one of the early tonalist guys. And his idea seemed to be to take a paintbrush with white on it and make a nice shape out of it. And then he turned some edges a little bit and that sort of thing. But you can see that he's much more like a cutout artist. He's still much more like a silhouetter. But when you get, how did I get ahead of myself here? I'll have to come, I guess I'll come backwards. I hope I didn't lose my, there it is. I did lose it for a second. But this is when you're starting to talk differently, right? And it is starting to, because eventually people stop using the outline of objects, as I've mentioned before, and it all becomes about silhouette. But it's silhouette at where legitimate silhouette happens. So we talk lost and found, right? So but in all paintings, this applies the same way. In fact, I can go back up to the Leighton and say how this applies. I will in a second. But silhouette is happening right there, right? Silhouette's happening right there, right? This is silhouette right here as we think of it. Sharp edge, high contrast, right? Or reasonably high contrast. Those are all silhouettes. Now, they're not silhouettes in the sense of an object having being set against another object of a different value. So when you think of silhouettes, most people think that's what we mean. But silhouette is simply highly reading contrast, edges, as we use it once you become an impressionist. So once you become a visual order impressionist, it's all about sharp edges. So what we're starting to mean now is the silhouette, meaning the sharp edge. And it happens very interestingly. It's the visual order of edges, right? where can I find a pure silhouette? Here's a piece of a dress, silhouettes against the light board back there. That's called silhouetting, right? So I'm not sure how you mean it, but I'm talking as a craftsman, I talk about what's useful, not what is factually, right? So it's true that if you said silhouette, you mean that silhouette's this. I mean, this my hand, if I can make a light version of my hand and a dark version, this dark part of my hand is silhouetting the other. This you might even, or this one, this light here is silhouetted. Is created. A silhouette is created of this portion of my hand against the backdrop. So if I can leave you with that idea, though, that we're not talking pure silhouette, we're talking about silhouettes. Let's see how Degas means it, though, because Degas is this guy who's saying it, right? So right here is pure silhouette. That's an actual silhouette. Here's a dress silhouetting against a leg, cuts off the foot, pure silhouette. The woman sits here in front of everybody else, the background, all that. So she is silhouetted by the background, however you want to put those things. So how do you want to use the term, But what's actually useful, right? So silhouette means one thing. So when I set an object in front of another object, I do it to create a silhouette, but I'm not thinking silhouette art. I'm thinking, or I'm not even thinking silhouette. I'm thinking now, read. What reads, okay? Because what an impressionist painting is that, in fact, all paintings is a distribution of things that read, rather in the order in which they read, right? And read is a funny word, but it means the silhouette so much that you can actually easily see what they're up to by shape, for example. So this here, you can easily see that. You can think of this as a silhouetting shape. It's truly a silhouette right here. Or, well, I guess you could say that this shirt this shirt is silhouetted. A silhouette is created by the jacket and all those things. But it doesn't have to be that. It can just simply be a light. So nevertheless, the point is we use these things. Here's silhouette. Here's a cutout, right? Here's a cutout. Here's a cutout. There can be a cutout right in the middle of form. I suppose technically you could say that every single time a light effect happens, it's a silhouette. There's something sitting in front of something else, right? But for our purposes, what we're really talking about, though, is the idea of the effect, the light effect with an edge, right? So we think of that as a more broad term. And the word silhouette suddenly takes on a whole different kind of meaning. And so you could say you can say there's kind of an order to the silhouetting. I'm looking at this, this silhouette's against that, but it's a soft edge, right? This silhouette's, it's a hard edge. So there's an order to all these levels. There's these levels of silhouettes, if you want to put them that way. As I said, I use it differently. Now, when we lay in a painting as an impressionist, we are looking at, now you want to call this a silhouette or do you want to call it a leading edge? So you see why the term isn't one of those things that I find valuable until you start using it the way we do. So you could say that's a silhouette, but the way it's useful. And this here, I don't know if that's a silhouette or not. It's just a sharp edge on a shadow, on an object. Now that puts, in a sense, the lie to the idea of the silhouette being the thing, right? Unless Degas is allowed to mean silhouette meaning that. Now, I don't know whether Degas meant that or not. We don't know what in the world he meant. But there's a finger, would you say silhouetting against the shadow of the other finger? Or would you say something else? I mean, there are shapes that read in here, different places, right through this hat, that read, as it were, like silhouettes. And do we have to use the word silhouette? Do we have to mean an object in front of another object, causing it to separate? Well, so that's a question. I don't think it's useful, though. I think the useful question is what reads. What cuts out with a. As Benson said, I think at one point, he said, one flat value meeting another flat value, that's where the drawing is. Well, is that what Degas meant? Is that what he meant? It's all silhouettes? By the way, what was it? So if you say it's all silhouettes, you'd have to be meaning something considerably more like what we mean, which is it, meaning is the action in a painting. Doesn't it mean that? And even when we say, where's the drawing, we mean where the high contrast is. So here you have this really high contrast. And yeah, that's an actual silhouette. But suppose you have a really high contrast that's a soft edge or turning edge. Now, do we think of that as not a silhouette? Because there's action here. That's key action. Or even along here, that's important action, right? And yet they're all part of the same object, so not technically silhouettes, right? that back in there would be a silhouette, right? Or this against the background is a silhouette. But what does that mean when you actually have major effects causing these things? And you say it's all silhouette, and yet these major effects aren't silhouettes per se at all, right? So it's interesting stuff. I mean, nevertheless, I'm talking about as a practical painter, what's useful out there. And so that's why you get yourself into that world of the visual order. You start talking, oh, so what reads, what doesn't read, and where do they play? And then you say, oh, yeah, if Degas meant that it's all about these top players, these sharp-edged, high-contrast things, which we can call silhouettes, and most of the time they are, in the pure sense of that word, then he would be right. Then we'd agree with him, and that would be a very useful use of the term. So here's a lay-in on the right by Degas, and you can see his use of the silhouette. Now, again, the sharp edge. And some of this edge isn't silhouetting per se. Some of it is. Silhouetting meaning an object against another object. But so that's a silhouette there. But this is just a sharp reading edge. And this dark hair meeting light hair, but is it silhouette per se, right? And notice, by the way, so I think of silhouette as cutout, right? I think of it as a cutout, like you think of it with the scissors I described earlier. So these are in this family of silhouettes, okay? That little thing right there, that's a silhouette. And this is what I'm finding is useful when the Boston School people are starting to talk to you about, or even Sargent talks about points and angles. Is he talking about silhouetting edges? Not necessarily. I mean, sometimes it actually could be a highlight in the middle of some area like that. But typically, and you can see the order of events here, very much like over in this passage here, you'll find there's an order by contrast with sharpness of edge. And for my purposes, I think of those and I use the expression silhouette to describe those events. Sometimes they're just a painted dark on a light. It's not technically a silhouette, but it might be the highest contrast in the neighborhood, like that spot might be. So if you follow what I mean, so there's a second question, and let's see if I can finish this off, and I'll come back to that other question. These are nice examples of pure silhouette, if you want to put it that way, objects in front of other objects. This is the one by Leslie Thompson, Boston School trained painter. But you can see it's all about silhouettes, and this is a nice example of Degas says it's all silhouettes. You'd look at that painting and say, there's a good example of that, what that might mean. And this one too, I mean, the silhouette of the head of the fiddle and the head of the woman and the silhouette of the hand. The game is all in these silhouettes. But it doesn't have to be full-bodied arm being fully silhouetted to do what we think of as silhouette. That edge, by the way, is that a silhouette? But these are the players. So if it's all silhouette, and what's happening in this picture is this and this and that or this or whatever in bigger ways all over the place at once, then you'd say, let's use the word a little more broadly. So now the last question, the question that you asked though, is about line, and so I really wanted to cover this just for a second, and that is I found this painting by Paxson. We all know this. I think we saw this in person when I was a student. But in both cases here, you look at paintings that were clearly set up as colored-in drawings, right? And they were the drawing was set and the drawing was maintained. In the case of Bouguereau, the guy would ink his drawings. He would have finished drawings and he would have them inked. And you can find now when they've overcleaned all these pictures, this horror that's happening in the museums today. They are taking everything off, but they can't take off the ink line. The ink line sits there underneath there. They've taken off all the paint because they've removed it with their varnish removers and taken off the varnish that's in the paint that's in the varnish below, and left us with these lines. But you can plainly see, and of course he describes one of his guys who worked with him described it as inked on with red ink, and you can see it actually does a phenomenally interesting thing. But so these all the way around here, you can see this outline, this very careful outline. And if you think the way a visual impressionist thinks, you'd say, that's funny. Nature isn't truly doing that, is it? And so the kind of question is it just that a person who works with outlines is actually rather stuck with lines than that he chooses to have them? So that's one question. And the second question is, if once you introduce line in a painting, isn't line one of the visual elements that has to actually be unified and has to participate with itself? If you're an artist, does it have an organizational quality as per line, per this abstraction called line, which doesn't exist in nature, right? Or rarely anything that you could see things that rather remind you of line, but they don't. Silhouette exists in nature, but line, the way we're describing it here, and by the way, this passage right here, when I saw this in person, I remember looking at it and thinking, that's astounding how bad that is. It looks like there's a pencil line there, like it's not even painted. Like he didn't even, it's just, that's my memory of it, by the way. It's been a while. But that's a question, right? So you find with Degas, and by the way, a beautifully drawn line is a beautiful thing. And I'm talking about just being able to see the linear thing, that just the contour. Contour is the wrong word, isn't it? But just the line quality per se, it's got its beauty of its own. So here you see line, and there's line on both sides of the hand, where it would, in a more visual way, it would disappear. So the argument, of course, with these guys, I really do think they're stuck. The argument that it's part of the beauty. We all love line. We love half-finished pictures because of certain qualities in them. But line drawing, line work, line, et cetera, isn't precisely the bailiwick of painting. It can be, obviously, or pastel. It's actually closer to being a useful thing in pastel. But it actually moves you further away from truth. So the question about bringing a line in as a way of making an accent or something like that, I suggest that's pretty dangerous, because now you have to say, if I bring one line in, don't I have to bring in two? Or does it become some curious, it becomes an accent. It makes you stare at it and wonder why there's a line here and nowhere else in the entire painting. So you see what that might set up. So that's my thought for you, Louise. I hope that has some use. The impressionist has this other orientation, though. Once you get to the point where you're trying to articulate the look of nature as a whole and in parts, and that's when this whole discussion starts happening, when you realize there is no line. That's a relatively new idea. Everybody believed. Didn't matter if there was a line. What mattered is that was how you had to get to your place. You had to get to your drawing because you had to draw the object. And that still, to some degree maintains with an imaginative painter. But you can see that it doesn't maintain with Sargent, who does imaginative paintings without using outlines. He also does some using outlines. Witness the Boston Public Library's murals, which if you haven't seen, you really are missing something very important. But he does it both ways. But his basic operating procedure, even when he's doing imaginative work, is to draw with outlines, without outlines, without line showing per se. And so in other words, it's the look of nature all the time at every location, including where you see a contour, what we call a silhouette. Okay? I better stop at that. If I can answer something more specifically, let me know what it is, Louise, or anybody else out there. And I'll see you next time. Do subscribe. There was another point I wanted to make, but I can't remember it. So you remind me if I... And we'll get back to you next time. But anyway, subscribe, like, share. Don't like, but if you don't like, actually make a comment that's a useful comment, like about what I'm wrong about, or why I think this versus that, et cetera, et cetera. I want the discussion if there's someone out there. So, all right, good. Next time.